So how does a sampled drum kit work? Well, to make one is not easy, but it's pretty straightforward conceptually. A company will hire a team of really good engineers, a really good studio, and they'll choose a drum kit and a room in that studio that are appropriate for what they're doing. For example, if they're making a sampled drum library that's intended to be used with metal records, they'll choose one of the drum kits that are well suited for that, and they might, for example, put it in a really large, really reverberant space so they can get those big, dramatic room sounds. If they were doing a sample library for funk music, they might go out and get an old 70s kind of more vintage sounding, tighter, smaller drum kit, and they might choose to record in a very dead, very muffled room, smaller, so that you can get that kind of dry, tight, characteristic 70s sound. They'll take their drum kit, they'll get a drum technician, they'll tune it, they'll make sure there are no rattles, they'll get everything working perfectly, and then they'll spend some time with kind of a collection of different microphones, just experimenting with what mics they want to place in different positions, trying different angles, trying different configurations, maybe different preamps and things like that, until they find exactly the sound they're looking for. And then they'll get a drummer, and they'll have that drummer actually work through each drum in turn, playing it from usually very softly to very loudly, and playing it in different styles. So if a drummer is doing samples on the snare, they might start by playing towards the edge of the snare very quietly, and then louder, and then they'll shift to the middle of the snare and play very quietly, louder, and then they might disengage the wires on the snare so it doesn't rattle, and then do the same thing. And what they do through this process is builds up a kind of a two-dimensional library of drum sounds. One dimension is the velocity or the intensity. They'll have quiet drum sounds, which sound very different from loud drum sounds. Not only are they louder or quieter, but they also have fundamentally different tone. They just sound very, very different. They have different kind of characteristics. The other axis is having multiple samples of the same thing. This is often called round-robin sampling. And this is when, instead of having a single snare sample that you play over and over again, you might have as many as 10 different samples and automatically cycle through them. And this gets rid of something that's called the machine gun effect, where you hear the same thing repetitively, and it means you're constantly cycling through the samples, which makes it sound much more realistic. And as I said, they might try it in different positions on the snare, they might record with brushes, they might record with mallets, they're going to go through all the options that they think you might realistically want and build up this big library of different samples. Now, it's important to note that when you record a sample, say you're recording the snare drum, you're not just recording the snare drum through the close mic. You're definitely going to get the close mic, but all of the other mics on the kit are also going to be picking up a little bit of bleed from that snare. Your overheads are of course going to be picking up that snare. That's a very important part of the sound. And your room mics are going to be picking up the snare and the way the snare reverberates in the room. So even though you've only got one hit, you actually are going to have, 10, 12, maybe more different sort of mic sources on that one sound. That adds a lot of dimension. Now, once they have these libraries of samples, which obviously takes kind of very painstaking work, they're going to put them all together in some kind of sampler, in this case, Contact. And they're going to line them up so that different velocities with MIDI are going to play different intensities of sample. And they're going to make sure that they automatically cycle through round robin. All the little details are available. They might also do things like play with different articulations. For example, it would be common to have snares played as a rim shot, snares played in the middle, snares played sort of halfway towards the edge, snares played with mallets, snares played with sticks. Go through all these options so that when you're programming the drums, you have a lot of tonal flexibility and you can pick different sounds to put them together. And once you've got this library, once you've got it all loaded up and programmed in Contact and all the layers working, all you need to do to use it is go in and program it using MIDI notes. At a basic level, that's just like programming a drum machine. You've got different notes will play different drums or different drum sounds, different velocities will play with different intensity. But there's some nuance or detail to that as well. There are some specifics about programming drums to say, manipulate how open a hi-hat is, or maybe add a little roll or a fill that are kind of specific to each library, and you just have to work out how to do these little details if you need them. Now, how close does a sample drum library sound to a drum library or a drum kit recorded for real? It's the kind of thing where even if you're an expert audio engineer, it would probably be pretty difficult for you to tell. They do sound really realistic, especially now the sampling techniques and the libraries have gotten so much better. That said, there are some differences. The two limitations of a sampled drum library, one is that you don't get quite the kind of vibe and depth. It never quite has the unified realism of a live performance captured in a real room. And that's just because you don't quite have all the complex interactions you would expect to see if you did it all at once with a real drummer. And the second issue you might run into is that you're stuck with whatever decisions have been made by the person recording the drums. Now, they're going to be a very skilled engineer or they wouldn't have this job, but it can be hard to do stranger or more experimental things. And in some styles of music, say a lot of indie rock these days, drums can be recorded in very idiosyncratic ways to get kind of strange results. Like say St. Vincent's material often has a very odd drum recording techniques. And so obviously you don't have the luxury of doing this. You're only going to be able to get the kind of more traditional, more standard sounds that the engineers have recorded for you. We're going to be taking a look at how to get started with actually writing or programming your own drum parts, the different ways you could do that, and where you might begin.